Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'll be reading the book of Mark, chapters 14 through 52. Rise up, let us go. Lo, he that betrayeth me is at hand. And immediately, while he yet spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves, from chief from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him, and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him. And they laid their hands on him, and took him. And one of them that stood by drew a sword, and smote a servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Are ye come out as against a thief, with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and ye took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. And they all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. This is the word of God.
Good job. Well, that was some great singing and very good reading. I appreciate that. Okay, let's get right into where we're at. This is right at the end of Jesus praying in the garden. There's a small garden on Mount of Olives that Jesus has gone into, deliberately gone into there. Very significantly has chosen that place for prayer, and he's gone in, and as he's done praying and the disciples are groggy, they're starting to wake up, here comes Judas Iscariot leading a band of soldiers, if you will, a band of enforcers, thugs who have come out to apprehend Jesus at night. Why at night? Because they don't have the courage to do it in broad daylight. They intend to politically manipulate the situation, to construct a narrative, to wag the dog, if you will, and create a reason why they're justified in doing it. But they can't do it in the light of day because there requires a tremendous amount of subterfuge, of deceit, of tomfoolery to happen in order for them to construct out of thin air a reason for apprehending Jesus. In this text we're looking at here and the one previous that Mike spoke on so well last Sunday, we see a tremendous amount of dense writing. And for the modern American, we're not very good at that. We're not very good at reading dense writing that really is very evocative of ancient imagery because we don't read a lot, just to be honest. And when we watch movies, about 3/4 of the way through, the director always puts in flashbacks because he knows nobody remembers what happened at the beginning. And that's the kind of narrative we want. So we're, the most common thing to hear when you're in the movie theater is when old people like my parents say, now who's that? And what is it they did? Right? That's very common. That's why they got to put in all those things. So when we read things like Mark, we think, oh, surely it's not. No, Mark is very dense. He has packed in a dense story. And it's not constructed out of fiction. Jesus also has, like I said, very deliberately picked the place where all this is going to take place, is going to transpire. He's very deliberately picked this garden for his prayer. Now you might think, well, is that really, I mean, you guys keep saying how it's dense and how it's meaningful and how are you sure it's not like you guys are just conspiracy nuts and you got like red yarn all over your office connecting? We do, but not just that. It's more than that. Yes, yes, and yes. Look, this isn't the only, we even in our modern American lineage or tradition, we have dense writing also. For instance, the Gettysburg Address. 272 words. Now, that isn't because Lincoln was incapable of coming up with a long speech. You can go back and read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and these weren't like debates today where they say, we'll give you 1 minute and then a 30-minute follow-up. That's just nonsense. No, these debates, Lincoln would stand up and speak for over an hour, and then Douglas would get up and speak for over an hour in rebuttal, and then Lincoln would get up and speak, and it would be like a 6-hour debate every night, and people would go and stand there and listen to that. So no, Lincoln was more than capable of writing it. Why did he do that? Well, the historian Andrew Ferguson says that he thinks that Lincoln intentionally made it so brief and so dense because he wanted it to be studied the way the Bible was studied. Lincoln, if you read what he wrote and the way he spoke, he's highly influenced by the Bible and how the Bible was written, and just that it just permeates his writing. So he wanted it to be studied, and B, he wanted it to be memorized. And up until very recently, both of those things are exactly what happened with the Gettysburg Address. Anyway, so this is an example of Americana where we have dense writing that we then pick apart and see all the meaning that has been packed into those few dense words. This is what Mark has done throughout his gospel, and he's particularly done it here. Think about where Jesus and Mark has recognized what Jesus has done and highlighted it. But think about where this transpires. It is truly the climax of the great epic of Jesus. And I don't mean the epic of Jesus when he was born. I mean, think further back. Mark starts the epic of Jesus with John the Baptist. Luke starts it back at his birth. Matthew runs it all the way back to Abraham. But John takes it back to before time itself. In the beginning, John says, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is taking the story of Jesus and connecting it all the way back to the original garden. And all the elements of the original garden are back again in this garden. And Jesus is reenacting the original Garden of Eden story. He is reenacting this in some ways and subverting it in many other ways. Along with all the elements of the original garden, you have all of the consequences that the sin in the original garden brought about. So all of this is packed in to this one place and this one event, and it's all coming together, and it all comes to a climax right here. And Jesus has some very important lessons to teach in this. And what happens in the garden is very, very exciting. You basically have what we would now call a Mexican standoff. You have the soldiers or the thugs, and they have their swords and sticks, and then the disciples, they have their swords. And Jesus is in the middle, and they're getting ears are being lopped off, and there's pushing and shoving, and there's someone running away naked, and they're holding the guy's clothes. I mean, it's just like this whole panorama. It's an amazing, exciting scene. And Jesus has words of rebuke for both sides. I love how he does this. It doesn't make you a popular person when you're like that. Normally, what you do is you rebuke those that are your enemies and you congratulate your friends. Jesus never does that. Never does that. He has words of rebuke for both. Let's look at them briefly. He has words for the soldiers, the thugs. He mocks them. He really does. He mocks these soldiers who have come out to arrest him in the dead of night. First of all, he mocks them for their clumsy political melodrama. That's what this is. This isn't a legal apprehension. They do not have a legal order of arrest. And Jesus points that out. They've come out with swords and sticks in the night outside of the city, far away from anybody who could be seen, especially the Roman authorities who could see this illegal activity. Because they want to get a hold of the narrative. They want to control the narrative, is the way it would be said in modern politics. They want to, by the time day breaks, they want all of Jerusalem to know that a criminal was captured in the act. Some act, surely. Surely he did something wrong. Nobody gets arrested for nothing. Isn't that how we all think? So if you're arrested, if you're handcuffed, if you're let out in hand, surely you did something. And they want that narrative. So that when they then bring up charges, all the minds of the people are already contaminated with this thinking. He must have been doing something wrong out there on that mountain. He must have been up to no good in that garden. Why else would the priest be out there in the middle of the night if it wasn't being caught in fraganti, in the act? So they are there with some real clumsy political melodrama. Because Jesus says, I've been in the temple every day. If you had charges, I was right there. But he also mocks them for their silly choice of weapons. He says, you come out here with swords and sticks. Silly choice of weapons because Jesus was dealing in words. And they couldn't handle that. They couldn't refute his arguments. So they think, we'll just go beat him with a stick. As if that wins any argument. If you're losing an argument, the solution is not violence. It actually makes it worse for you. Well, that's what they've done. They can't beat him in his arguments. They can't refute his doctrine. They can't prove him wrong. So they come out in the night and they bring out swords and sticks. And he mocks them for it, deservedly. But also he mocks them for it because look at what's going on here. You have the kingdom of love and forgiveness being persecuted by the kingdom of swords and sticks. They're coming up against the kingdom of God, which is a kingdom of power, incredible, immense power, and the best they can pull out is a sword and a stick. That would be like you and I getting out a handful of rocks and going and throwing them at Kim Jong-un and his nuclear missiles. How foolish and silly that would look. It's like that, only worse. Jesus is raising the dead, and their best response, their retort is to kill somebody. You realize how foolish they are. But they don't have anything else. That is the depth of their armory. That's it. They pull out the big guns. And Jesus mocks them for it. This really does epitomize the categorical distinction between God and this world, particularly God and Rome. The sword, or as they call it, the Romans, in Latin it's called the gladius. That's where we get the word gladiator. A gladiator is one who wields the sword. That's what the word means. Gladius is the sword. That is the sword that the Roman legionnaires carried. Little short, about a 23-inch long sword, kind of a wasp belly, a wasp waist down the bottom. It comes up to a sharp point. It was devastating. It was a devastating weapon, so much so that historians note that other defeated provinces got rid of their bejeweled weapons. They'd have swords that were shiny and had all these encrusted with gems and stuff. They got rid of those because those were for looks. The Roman sword, it wasn't a looker, but it was very effective. And that kind of was the emblem of Rome's power, was that legionnaire sword. And Jesus is mocking the whole system. But he also has words for his disciples. He admonishes them as well. Now, this must have been very confusing for the disciples. What happens is they come out, they pull out the swords, the disciples get up, Peter pulls out his sword and lops off an ear. And Jesus rebukes him. Now, that must have been very confusing. We find out through John's account of the Last Supper that happened just hours before, that Jesus is telling them, if you don't own a sword, sell your cloak and go buy one. Now, wouldn't that be confusing to you? If Jesus just said, look, you need a sword so bad, you should sell your jacket to buy one, and then here comes all these people, and they all have swords, and you think, well, this must be what he's talking about. When we did it, we find out in the John's account that only a couple of them had swords. Obviously, Peter was one of them. He must have felt very proud of himself. He was the Boy Scout. He was prepared. Not like all those other loser disciples who didn't bring the sword. He brought the fire to the show. And he pulls it out and he uses it. And Jesus says, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? Jesus, just short time before that, had said, I've come to bring a sword on the earth. Well, you're going to bring a sword, and I can't bring a sword? So yeah, probably very confusing. But they were not understanding what he was saying. And this is typical of Christians. We don't like complexity. We want yes or no answers. I get questions like that all the time. And usually my answer is, that's not a yes or no question. And that's why a lot of people don't want to ask me questions, because I don't have a lot of yes or no answers. But there aren't that many yes or no answers. Things are almost always a lot more complicated than that. And we don't like that. That's why, ultimately, we can talk all we want about liberty and conscience, but we really like the law because it's so comforting. You just know yay and nay, and you don't have to think about it. It's not that way. Jesus has said on one hand, I'm going to bring a sword on the earth, and if you don't have a sword, you better go out and get yourself a sword. And then the moment it seems like if there any more appropriate time, and you pull it out and you use it, he says, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? Don't you understand what's going on? And if you're like me, you're like, I have no idea what's going on. I am very confused right now. Very confused. So Jesus points out that they're making three big mistakes. One is they're using swords to circumvent God's will. When Jesus says you need to buy a sword, he is talking about self-defense. And the Bible is not against self-defense. But part of having the right to defend yourself is having the responsibility to know when. And you don't get to defend yourself against the will of God. Jesus had defended himself against this very type of situation. It's very possible that Judas Iscariot assumed that he could just turn a quick buck and Jesus would do what he did in Capernaum and what he did in Nazareth. He would just walk through them. No harm, no foul. But he didn't do that. He had already shown multiple times that if it wasn't his time, they couldn't touch him. But when it came to be his time, when he prays to the Father and says, not my will but yours, and the Father says, it's time, then he did not use his power to defend himself. And he expected the disciples to know that difference also. In fact, in the account of John, Jesus tells Peter, put up your sword. The cup which my Father has given me, Shall I not drink it? It's not the time to fight. It's the time to accept the will of God. Well, that's a hard thing to do. Just if we're talking about just simple self-defense, when is it appropriate then to defend yourself? Well, that's a difficult question. Very complicated. The second thing he rebukes them for, the disciples, is that they're buying into the will to power of the world, the will to power, especially that of the Roman world. Everything was about power for Rome. Everything was about power. In fact, ever since the Garden of Eden and sin, everything has been about power. And Jesus is subverting that world order. He's subverting that. He tells Peter again, put up your sword, and this is Matthew's account, for all that take up the sword shall perish with the sword. He's telling him what you're engaged in is a circle of death. And I'm here to break that circle. I'm not here to perpetuate it. I'm here to break that circle of violence and death, where you have the sword and you live by it and you conquer and then you're conquered. They should be able to look around the pagan world around them and even within their own country, the Jewish nation, and see this same horrible, vicious cycle of violence going around and around and around. The disciples are essentially believing the lie of Satan, that they can pursue power of their own force, by their own strength, by their own will. Jesus is rebuking them for that. And third thing he's rebuking them for is that they're becoming guilty of the same act that they're allegedly fighting to prevent. You notice who Peter attacks? He does not attack an armed guard. He attacks a slave. He chops off the ear of a slave. You know why? Because that's safe. Nobody's going to indict you in the Roman world for cutting off the ear of a slave. You'd barely get a slap of the wrist under Jewish law. Barely. You might have to pay a small fine. If Peter had attacked an armed guard, that would have been a very different story. See, Peter is virtue signaling. Just like he had before. I'll die with you. Watch me cut the ear off a slave. See, I'm a man. That's what the world had been about. Trample the oppressed, trample the marginalized, trample the poor. Anyone who can't stand up to you, you can stomp all over them. That's exactly what Peter's doing in kind. He's not differentiating himself from them. He's just being them. He's becoming them. Jesus doesn't. We're told in another account, not here, but we're told in another account that Jesus takes the time in the middle of all of this incredible tumult that's going on. Jesus just stops everything and heals that man's ear because he cares about the slave. He's subverting the world order. Everyone there, they don't care one whit about Malchus. He cares about him so much he heals them and gives us his name. We don't know the name of anyone else in that army except for the slave that Jesus cared about. He's saying, this is the new world order. The first will be last, and the last will be first. And he's telling his disciples, you're not going to be like them. We're not them. And we don't fight fire with fire, and hatred with hatred, and violence with violence. So is it very complicated? Extremely complicated. Extremely complicated. How do we navigate these complexities? Well, through good conscience. What we might call godly sincerity. And that's tough. And that's a topic for another day. But I want you to notice that what Jesus has done in this story is he has subverted the sword itself. As I said, the sword was the emblem of Rome, the Roman Empire, world, government. It was the end. Before Christ, the logo of practically every world government, world power, was the sword. Just constant battle, fighting, killing, murder. You want to know why there were so few people on earth? Because they killed them all off all the time. It's estimated that when Julius Caesar went into war with the Gauls, 2 million people died. A massive genocide. And why? Because the Gauls had attacked? No. Because in Rome there was one way to become powerful: the sword. You want to reach the council? You want to reach the triumvirate? You want to become Caesar himself? How did Julius become Caesar? Liquidating the Gauls. That's how. Jesus says, I'm going to subvert this. We're going to break the cycle of living and dying by the sword. But he's not just saying that the sword will no longer make anyone great. He's actually saying it never did. It never did. Nobody has ever been great by it. They just fabricated a fiction in which it looks great. It's like the fiction that Hollywood fabricates for its movie stars. It isn't real. Those people are not geniuses. There's 100 people in a room writing those lines. They're actually not that quick. I've heard them interviewed live. Most of them actually are pretty dumb. They're just good at memory. This is what Jesus is talking about. Jesus was not just going to exchange one greatness for another. He was going to exchange death for life. Complete subversion of these things. Remember I told you that Jesus said he came to put sword in the earth? He did. But he came to put a very different kind of sword in this earth. The sword he came to put, it talks about it in Hebrews. It says, for the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and the joints and marrow, and is discerner of the thoughts and the intents of the heart. That's Jesus' sword. The sword of Jesus doesn't cut outward. It doesn't lop off people's ears. It circumcises your own heart. It cuts off the membrane off of your blind eyes. It cuts inward. This is the summary of his complaint with Peter and the disciples. They should have been looking in. Peter was almost in a fit of projection and braggadocio, is going out trying to maybe diversion, right? He's starting to wave around the sword. Why? Because inside he knows he's ill prepared for spiritual battle. He hasn't been praying. He hasn't understood the doctrine. He's not calm and collected like Jesus is. Jesus has told him, Satan is going to sift you. He is going to shake you around. And you're not going to be ready. And he's not ready. So he does what we all do and puts on a big show, flails around like the fish that puff up. Maybe we can fool everybody. Because he hasn't turned the sword of Jesus inward. Dealt with himself. Let me put this in concrete terms. Let me bring it down to an example that maybe will resonate. There's a lot of them I could give. I mean, the sword of Jesus, we could say, is forgiveness. The sword of Jesus is mercy, patience, generosity. You want to strike out at the power of this world? You can't do it through violence, through armed resistance, through use of force. That's the world's sword. You do it like Jesus did. You heal a slave's ear. You forgive a prostitute's sins. You heal a blind man's eyes. You forgive someone who's wronged you. Let's talk about forgiveness as an example. Could use all of them, but let's just talk about, you might say, well, forgiveness, how is that a victory? How can you achieve victory like that? How? And this is the typical Western individualistic mindset. If I forgive someone, how does that help me? Well, let me put it bluntly. It doesn't. When you forgive, you don't win. Timothy Keller wrote probably the best book, the best book I've read on the subject of forgiveness, called aptly Forgive. Great book. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you get it and read it. But he makes a very obvious point, but at the same time, I think brilliant. Right? He basically says, and I'll paraphrase, he says, if somebody steals $100 from you and you forgive them, you're absorbing the loss. You're paying the cost. You don't get to collect some other way. God isn't saying, if you forgive them, I'll pay you back. He's saying, you forgive them, meaning you absorb the loss. That's forgiveness. That's forgiveness. So you don't get a victory. You don't get to reclaim your honor. You give it up. You relinquish it. The right for retribution, you relinquish it. You know what that is? Jesus told a story about this. It gets often very misunderstood, but he says there's two debtors, right? One owes a lot, one owes a little. The one who owes a lot is forgiven by the king, and then he finds his friend who owes him a little bit, and he doesn't want to forgive, and so he pounces on him and he beats him up and says, you'll pay me or I'm going to beat you to within an inch, whatever. And the king hears about it, he brings him back, and he revokes his pardon, and the moral of the story, Jesus says, is, if you don't forgive, you aren't forgiven. Now, we often misunderstand that. We think what he's saying is, if we want God to forgive us, we have to forgive other people. That's not what he's saying. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, if you don't know how to forgive, it's because you aren't forgiven. Let me try to put it in a picture. Forgiveness that you only receive but don't give is not real forgiveness. It's like dreaming of water in the middle of the desert. It's not real water. It's like standing in the snow outside of a brightly lit dining room, looking in through the window and seeing a family smiling and eating Christmas dinner together. That's forgiveness that's only received but not given. It's not real. It's imaginary. Because forgiveness is not something that is like an object that you can have and decide what to do. Forgiveness is a reality that you either inhabit or you don't. What Jesus is saying is, if you don't forgive, it's because you don't live in forgiveness. You're outside in the snowbank looking in at it, but you have not truly experienced it. Because if you had experienced it, you'd realize that it creates a reality. It's an alternate reality. And that's what Jesus is doing in the garden. He's creating an alternate reality. And in doing so, he's completely befuddling and mocking all of these soldiers who believe that what they're holding is real. And he's saying, it's all a lie. I'm real. My sword is real. How real was the sword of Jesus? Within less than 400 years, the mighty Roman Empire had completely caved. Christianity had overrun it, not with armies. What the Visigoths couldn't do, what the Gauls couldn't do, what the Italians could, nobody could do it. They did it, and they never had to lift a fist. The last pagan emperor, Julian the Apostate, is said to have died with his own blood filling the sand at his feet, and he grabbed the sand, he throws it in the air and says, "You have won, Galilean." So Jesus is calling us. He's calling us into this alternate reality. He's saying, come in out of the snow. Come in out of the cold. Come in out of the desert. Come in. There's a real world that is completely different. It's not about whether you'll win or lose. You'll lose a lot. In fact, you might lose your life. But what you'll get in return is something so much better. Lay down the swords. Lay down the hatred. Hatred is like dreaming you eat a bitter meal. You wake up glad you didn't eat it, but you still have the indigestion. So you're hungry and sick. That's what hatred is like. Jesus has a different sword. It's a sword of love. Incredibly powerful. And this is what he's telling the disciples, and he's telling the soldiers. Why are you coming out here with these things? Why are you subverting everything that's good? Judas subverting love with a kiss to betray. Why are you doing this? I'm offering you a better life. This is the power that Jesus is wielding here in the garden. And he's pressing us to accept it. He wants you to receive him. It's the only pathway into this alternate reality. You have to receive Christ. You have to embrace him. How does the psalmist put it? Kiss the Son, lest he be angry. Not like Judas. Lay down your weapons. Lay down your resistance. Lay down your doubts. And embrace Jesus Christ. And enter into a world where love reigns. Not just in the ever, ever after. Right here, right now, tangibly, really does reign. Because Jesus reigns. Let's close with prayer. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your Son, who is so much more than an example. He is a great Savior, Redeemer. Father, I ask that if there's anyone here today who has not met him, does not know him intimately in this way, that you'd open their eyes, that you would turn this mighty sword of yours, of your word, into their hearts. Divide apart the intentions, the thoughts. Bring clarity of mind to them so they can understand the power of the gospel. We ask these things in his name, in the name of Jesus.